Hey everybody, it's Audrey from Audrey Approved. Welcome back. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk about all of my favorite nonfiction authors. It is still technically Nonfiction November, so I thought I would squeeze this one in. And yeah, I want to talk about why I like these authors. I'm going to talk about all of the books that I have read from these authors, which is sometimes their entire backlist, but sometimes just a portion of it. And I will maybe make a recommendation on where I would start with this author if you're interested in picking them up for the very first time. Yeah, there were no hard or fast rules. My only qualifiers were I had to have read at least 2 books from the author. I can't have hated any of their other books, and I guess the true litmus test is if I knew that they had a new book coming out in 2025, would I be excited to read it? And if the answer was yes to all of those, then I threw them into this video. Okay, the first author I want to talk about is Kevin Fedarko. Again, I'm going in no particular order. Kevin Fedarko I read for his adventure stories and for his nature writing. He has a way of describing a landscape in a way that is so evocative and beautiful that I just haven't come across before. Both of his books have to do with Grand Canyon National Park, so if you're about to make a visit, they're great books to pick up. His most recent release is A Walk in the Park, which accounts his 750-mile journey by foot, backpacking, as he travels the length of the Grand Canyon. So many people, they might do a day trip, they might backpack from rim to rim, but Kevin Fedarko is walking the entire length of the Grand Canyon with his close friend, a National Geographic photographer. And intermixed into this journey is the story of the Grand Canyon itself, its native peoples, its geology, its political history. Yeah, I really liked it. It's also narrated by the author himself. His other book, which is the first one that I read and the one that I would probably recommend starting with, is The Emerald Mile, which is all about the Colorado River, which is the river at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And it's really about our relationship with the Colorado River, whether it be through whitewater rafting or whether it be through the engineering and construction of dams like the Glen Canyon Dam. And, I admit, as I say that, right, it doesn't sound super engrossing, but I loved The Emerald Mile. The Emerald Mile might make a top 10 books of all time list for me. I don't know, maybe I should make that list, but it would be one that I would consider putting on it, just because I loved how Kevin Fedarko tells his story. His storytelling is so great, and really, again, the human relationship with nature. So yeah, huge fan. If you're going to visit the Grand Canyon, absolutely pick up something that he has written. I eagerly anticipate whatever he comes out with next. I kind of hope he deviates away from the Grand Canyon, but even if he stays with the Grand Canyon, I will again read whatever he releases next. Adam Higginbotham was a 2024 find, the best 2024 find of the year so far, and the year is almost over. I love his books for their deeply researched investigative journalism and for the way he really humanizes people. Both of his 2 main books have to do with 1986 disasters, and in particular I think Higginbotham is attracted to or is really good at describing technical disasters. So when something like engineering judgment or engineering, technical issues comes up against human nature or the way that we respond to these disasters. His 2 books are Challenger and Midnight in Chernobyl. I read Challenger first. It's about the destruction of the Challenger space shuttle. Again, I really love this one, and so I went to Midnight in Chernobyl next, which I think is probably more well known from him, which I think is a more complex story. Midnight in Chernobyl, there's way more pieces and impacts and repercussions and threads to follow in the actual disaster itself than something like Challenger. I think Challenger is a little bit less technical. I think Midnight in Chernobyl is a little bit more technical, but you should pick up whichever book sounds more interesting to you. Both of them were very solid 5-star reads for me, and I absolutely recommend both. The only other book that I've read from Higginbotham is 1,000 Pounds of Dynamite, which I debated reading or not because it's only available through Amazon. It's only 100 pages, so it's almost like an essay. But I decided to read it because it has to do with a bomb threat that took place in South Lake Tahoe, and I'm familiar with that area of South Lake Tahoe, and so I was interested to hear more of, I guess, local history there. Again, it has to do a little bit with like the engineering behind the bomb making, which was a very kind of unique and tricky bomb. I don't know if I would recommend picking it up. You should start with Challenger, Minna, and Chernobyl. If you absolutely love Higginbotham, you can read this one, but I don't think it's necessary to pick this one up. Laura Cumming is a art critic, and I think out of all the authors that I talk about today, she might be the one that might be more of a miss for maybe the average reader, but she really works for me. I, again, love how she talks about art, but I admit that her books are really slow, really meandering, and really sometimes hard to get to a specific, destination. But I really enjoy, again, how she talks about art. She's so passionate in the way that she describes a painting to every meticulous, detail and feeling and emotion when she looks at just a single piece of art. I have read Vanishing Velazquez, which is about a missing Velazquez portrait of, I think, King Charles I, maybe the second. I think it's King Charles I. That one was entertaining, but I definitely think the one to start with is Thunderclap, which is her more recent release. This one might be known to y'all because it made the long list of the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction in 2024. And this, I would say, is part memoir, part art history. It's a lot about the author's relationship with her artistic father, and then intermixed into this is a lot of history on various Dutch artists. Again, it's like meandering, it winds here and there, but I love how she talks about the paintings, and she introduced me to quite a few new Dutch artists that I hadn't heard of before. You definitely need to read this, like if you do it in an audiobook, you need to do it in conjunction with a print or an ebook copy so you can look at the photos themselves. But yeah, I'm a huge fan. She has one more book about art, which is about self-portraits. I forget the title. I'll put it up. I think it's more of a reference or a coffee table book, but I still might try to pick it up and try it, because again, I'd love anything that she writes about paintings and art history. Yeah, again, it's a hit for me. It might not be a hit for everybody else. Susan Casey is another female nonfiction writer who writes about all things oceans. She blends, I would say, investigative journalism and personal storytelling to write about various ocean-related topics. She has a book about big waves, so writing, she calls them rogue waves. She's got a book about the deep sea. That's her most recent release. She has a book about dolphins, and she has a book about the Farallon Islands, which is a small set of islands off of the coast of San Francisco. I would say that she really meanders in and out of topics. So if you like your nonfiction authors to stick with a topic and stay there and stay focused, you will probably not like it. My boyfriend actually really doesn't like Susan Casey for this very reason. I really like that kind of stuff. I really enjoy it. I'm here for the ride. But yeah, if you like, again, your authors to be active participants in the story, she has a lot of personal reflection. She tells you what she's thinking, what she's feeling, what she's doing. Again, if you don't like that, then you won't enjoy her books at all. I would say probably start with just whatever book seems the most interesting to you. I think maybe the most accessible will be the one about the deep sea, which is her more recent release, or maybe even the Rogue Wave was one. I found her dolphin book, which is called Voices in the Ocean, extremely depressing. And actually maybe less about dolphins and more about human relationships with dolphins and how we have hurt them and killed them in so many different ways. I would read The Devil's Teeth, which is the one about the Farallon Islands, only if you are a local to the San Francisco Bay Area, in which case it's a really interesting piece of kind of local history, and you can see the Farallons, when you're looking out towards the ocean. But yeah, I go to Susan Casey for all things ocean related, and I will eagerly pick up whatever she talks about next. Richard Lloyd Parry might be a name you recognize if you watched my most recent video, which was my Nonfiction November TBR and Rex video, because my pick for the code word, join, I think, was People Who Eat Darkness by Richard Lloyd Parry. And this is the second book that I have read from this author. And I think Richard Lloyd Parry has very unique reads because, in my perspective, he writes about Japanese topics as a Westerner, but for a Western audience. Maybe let me explain that. He is a British journalist who has lived in Tokyo for the last 30 or so years. He has Japanese family now, he's got children, and so he deeply understands both the language and the culture. But he also, you know, he grew up in Britain, he's a Western man, and so he can really explain the small differences in things like language or cultural norms that are not, I would say, obvious right off the bat. And so I think he provides this really unique, intimate window into Japanese culture in a way that I think only, you know, an expat could write about. His two books are about, they're very different, but they're about, one is about the disappearance of a British woman who was working in these hostess bars in 2000 and her disappearance. And the other book is Ghosts of the Tsunami, which is about the 2011 Japanese earthquake, which resulted in a tsunami, which killed like 18,500 people, including all of the children in a specific Japanese village. And yeah, I just find that both these topics are they both deal with death, you know, they're both hard and difficult topics, but he approaches them with such respect and such nuance and a lot of compassion. And so if he releases any more books about, you know, events in Japan, I will absolutely eagerly pick it up. But again, I think he just provides a really unique perspective, although I'd be interested to hear what other people living in Japan or Japanese residents think of his stuff. Yeah, I'd be very curious to have that conversation in the comments down below. Jon Krakauer is an author that probably many of you have read before, have heard of before, and he's an example where some of his books I have read, some books I'm less interested in. I would say it's a little bit hard to bucket his work, but he's an investigative journalist who is really interested in, I would say, nature stories, especially like man versus nature, but he's also interested in, I guess, like big societal structures. So he's got one about college rapes. He's got one about Mormon fundamentalism, but then again, he has all these stories about kind of nature and exploration and adventure writing. Jon Krakauer has this tendency to really drop the reader right in the middle of an opening scene, right at the beginning of a book. And then as soon as he kind of catches your attention, he zooms out, and then, you know, maybe chapter 1 starts with the history, and eventually he'll take you on a journey to get back to that moment of time that he first described in, say, his prologue. He tends to always do that in all of his books, and I think it works every time to hook the reader. Jon Krakauer hasn't come out with a kind of new investigative piece in the last, say, 10 years. So I really hope that 2025 is the year, but yeah, we'll see. His most famous book is definitely Into Thin Air, which is different because it is a memoir, and it recounts the author's time climbing Mount Everest in 1996 in the midst of a disaster that killed multiple people from his expedition. This is really the book that hooked me because I have never finished a book as quick as I finished Jon Krakauer, I feel. Maybe that's not true, but it's really up there. Like, I finished it in a single day in effectively a single sitting because I was just really engrossed and wanted to know what happened. And after that, I decided to read more of his stuff, and none of it has actually disappointed. He's got a book called Into the Wild, which is about a man who goes out into the Alaskan wilderness and lives by himself. But it's really this young man, I think he's in his early 20s, and Jon Krakauer almost romanticizes this man's experiences, but he really explains, you know, how did this man get into this situation. This is maybe my lesser favorite of the books that I've read from Jon Krakauer. One that I enjoyed more was Under the Banner of Heaven, which is all about Mormon fundamentalism. It has a ton of history on the birth of the Mormon Church, and then it kind of deviates off into Mormon fundamentalism, and especially the events that occurred around the murder of a woman. It's a really hard read. There's a lot of sexism, there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of other bad things that happen in this book, and so I wouldn't pick it up if you are not in the right mindset. And I will also say that for a book about religion, it's important to note that this is written from a very secular kind of point of view. I have tried to read Missoula by Jon Krakauer, which is about the rape system in the town of Missoula in Montana and a whole bunch of college rapes that occurred there. It was really difficult to read. This is a book that I still want to finish, but I had to put down because I just wasn't in the mood to read about this topic. But he does have a few other full-length books that I have not picked up that I'm just a little bit less interested in. He does have 2 essay collections. One is called Classic Krakauer and one is Eiger Dreams. And these to me are more like if you want adventure stories. So if you want mountain climbing, mountaineering, surfing, anything extreme sports or anything like that, then you might enjoy these. They're just collections of long-form articles that he has written for various newspapers in the past. And I think I wouldn't start with these essay collections, but if you already know you like Krakauer and you like adventure stories like this, then you're not going to be disappointed with either of these books. Patrick Radden Keefe is another author who might make, other people's favorite nonfiction authors lists. He's very popular, especially on BookTube, and for very good reason. He also does investigative journalism and narrative nonfiction, and I would say he, out of many of these authors, is very clear on that dividing line. So he doesn't include his personal thoughts or beliefs in a way that, say, Susan Casey does or other authors that I'm about to talk about. He really kind of separates those two. And so if you like that clean separation of author and topic, then you might like Patrick Radden Keefe. He is mainly focused on crime, but I would say not true crime like serial killers. He's interested in crime that has social repercussions or crime that kind of reverberates through society. And I think out of any author that I'm talking about today, he is the most skilled at interweaving disparate storylines in a way that is not obvious until he finally takes you to that place where these different storylines converge. I think many other authors that I'm talking about today do this, but Patrick Radden Keefe is, I would say, the most talented in doing that. The only book that I have not read from his backlist is Chatter, which is his first release. It's released in 2005, and it's all about eavesdropping. But a lot of things have happened in the last 20 years when it comes to technology, so I'm a little bit worried that this is going to be super out of date. But if you have read it recently and you do enjoy this book, let me know so I can decide if I want to pick it up or not. But I have read everything else from Patrick Radden Keefe, which consists of 4 other books. Empire of Pain is the first book that I picked from Patrick Radden Keefe, and it's the first book I read from him, and it's probably the one that I would recommend other people start with as well. It's his most recent release. It's about the Sackler family, which is a very famous philanthropic family that I think lives in New York. And they're very well known for their donations to arts and the sciences, but they are also the family behind Purdue Pharma, which is the company that produced OxyContin, which is blamed in many ways for America's opioid epidemic. And so this is a story of the birth of that company, of the family itself. And I think it is a really engrossing read of a family and an industry that has impacted so many lives of Americans. The other really famous book by Patrick Radden Keefe is Say Nothing, which I admit I actually picked up. I guess technically this is the book that I picked up first, but I DNF'd it. I actually put it down, and then I read Empire of Pain, and then I went back to Say Nothing, picked it up again, and ended up really enjoying it. I would say that this book is, on its surface and its blurb, it's about the murder of a woman, but it isn't really. It's more so about the legacy of violence for Ireland's Provisional Irish Republican Army, the Provisional IRA, during the Troubles in Ireland. And so I think if you don't know a lot about the Troubles, this is kind of a hard one to start with, because you're really kind of dropped into the topic. But I really enjoyed this one, and I think it actually is my favorite of the Patrick Radden Keefe books because I think there's just a lot of things that he says about memory and how we think about events that have occurred in the past in a way that I just really enjoyed. And again, his interweaving of storylines in this book is particularly excellent. He also has a book called The Snakehead, which is about illegal Chinese immigration into the United States in the late 80s, early 90s, which is very relevant to today, I think, still. But again, it's a little bit dated in its topics. I thought this one was good, but the interweaving of storylines is better in his other two books, and I think the topics themselves are just a little bit more interesting. And then lastly, he has a collection of essays similar to Krakauer, which is called Rogues, which is a collection of long-form articles from, his journalism background. It's not the place to start with Patrick Radden Keefe, but if you have finished everything else and you just are craving a little bit more, then you'll enjoy this one as well. Daniel James Brown is an author that I don't hear talked about a ton on BookTube, and was one of the authors that really kicked off a lot of my nonfiction obsession in the last few years. Daniel James Brown is similar to Patrick Radden Keefe in that he writes narrative nonfiction, he does investigative journalism, he tells very humanistic stories, he does these kind of interweavings of storylines, but he's very focused specifically on American history. And in particular, I would say like obscure American history. Kind of like Timothy Egan, if you've read Timothy Egan books, but I like his books a lot more than Timothy Egan. One of the reasons I really love Daniel James Brown is because he's such a humanistic author. Again, he talks about these big kind of historical American events, but he talks about them by telling the story of just a few people that, experience the events themselves. And I think by doing this, by pulling us into the lives of just a very few number of individuals, he makes these events feel very real and in a way that the reader can really emotionally connect with the story and the history and all of the things that happened. And so this is my favorite thing about Daniel James Brown. He would probably make a top 3 nonfiction authors list. If I really had to cut down all the people that I'm talking about today, he would make a top 3. Because again, he's just so humanistic in the way that he talks about these subjects. Another thing I like about him is his extremely descriptive language, the way he talks about a landscape or a people or an event, I think really brings it to life for me. And then lastly, similar to Susan Casey, he does many of these diversions into different topics that I find really relevant. So, he might be talking about a historical event and the actions that occurred during that event, but he'll bring in like modern psychology to talk about why those people might have made the choices that they made in that instance. And I find that really adds to the overall, takeaway of his books. And so those are many of the reasons why Daniel James Brown is so highly rated for me when it comes to nonfiction. I have read Brown's entire backlist, and I would say I wouldn't start with Under a Flaming Sky, which is the first book that he released and covers a big firestorm that happened in, I think, Minnesota in the late 1800s, which killed a lot of people. And it's a really emotional, really graphic read, again, because Brown brings in so many of these human storylines. But I probably wouldn't start here because he follows a wide cast of people here, and I think in his later books he's more effective in that he only down selects to a specific few individuals. And so I actually wouldn't start here. I would read this after his other books. The first book that I read from Daniel James Brown was The Indifferent Stars Above, which again you might recognize because I recommended it in my last video for Nonfiction November, which is all about the Donner Party. And the Donner Party is really well known because they had to resort to cannibalism. But it's a story that is not sensationalized in any way. It's just reported on really wonderfully. And again, he follows just a specific individual, this time a young woman, and her experiences as being part of the Donner Party. And so he tells the events that happened through kind of what happened to her. I'd highly recommend this one, although if cannibalism is a little bit too graphic for you, then you can start with The Boys in the Boat, which is by far his most famous work. Boys in the Boat was made into a movie at the end of last year. I don't think it's a very good movie, but it was made into a movie. And it's all about the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, and it has to do with college rowing at the University of Washington. And I actually really avoided picking this book up because it kept getting recommended to me, but I was like, I don't really care about team sports. I don't really care about rowing or college athletics. But again, it just goes to say that, like, I don't care about the topic, but this is a very solid 5-star read because of the human stories behind it. I think that if, yeah, again, the cannibalism is too much for you, for the Indifferent Stars Above, this is the book to start with for Daniel James Brown. And then lastly, his most recent release is Facing the Mountain, which is all about Japanese American soldiers during World War II. So they're fighting on the front, they're risking their lives in Europe, and yet many of their family members are being held without rights in Japanese internment camps back home. And so what are the stories of these men that fought, why they fought, and as well as the stories of their families. Yeah, it's really good. I just feel like this topic I wasn't as interested in. It was a little bit of a longer book. It's a very solid 4-star read for me, but I did enjoy his other books more than this one. I've only read 3 books from Michael Pollan, so I was debating if I wanted to include him in this video today because I haven't read the majority of his backlist. But I decided to include him because of the 3 books that I have read from Michael Pollan. I have given all of them 5 stars. Michael Pollan is a food social commentary writer. He blends kind of food writing and food politics with a lot of personal reflection. So like Susan Casey, you know, he is telling you what he thinks. He's telling you about all of these people that he's meeting. He's bringing you along as he learns about the subject that he is exploring. So there is a lot of his personal thoughts on food and food politics and what we eat that are included in here. So if you disagree with what he thinks, you might not enjoy this book or his books. I tend to really agree with what he says, or a lot of it resonates with me. I like the way that he thinks about food and our decisions around food. And I also really enjoy that he's local. He lives in the Berkeley area near UC Berkeley. And so sometimes he talks about things that are familiar to this area. And so I enjoy that. So for example, in one of his books, he talks about a bakery. I've gone to that bakery. I've tried the bread that he learned how to make there. You know, it adds something special to the experience of reading his books. The first book that I read from Michael Pollan was The Botany of Desire, which is all about how plants and humans have evolved together. And he looks at this through the interactions between humans and plants when it comes to potatoes, apples, tulips, and marijuana. This is the first book, again, that I read from Michael Pollan. It's very accessible, very easy to read. Another book that I think would be a great place to start, maybe the one I would recommend starting with out of the 3, is Cooked, which again is divided into 4 sections, this time the 4 different elements, so earth, water, air, fire. And he talks about the chemical transformation that is cooking. So like in fire, he talks about barbecue, he talks about beer brewing, he talks about bread making, stuff like this. And yeah, I again really enjoyed Cooked as well for its very kind of thoughtful but yet accessible exploration of our relationship with how we change food into things that we like to eat. And I would say the third book is the one that is the book he's most famous for, but maybe one that I think is a little bit inaccessible, or not inaccessible, but harder to read. And that is The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is all about, again, how do we decide what we have for dinner? And in this book, Pollan looks into food industry, agricultural history. He looks into food supply chain, and there's a lot of kind of bigger and more political questions that he analyzes here. But again, I really like his work. So yeah, if you are looking for food analyses, then I would recommend picking up Michael Pollan if you haven't already. And if you have read more books from him beyond these that you've really enjoyed, please let me know down below so I know what to prioritize next. And then very lastly, I want to quickly mention David Sedaris, which is the only kind of true memoir author that is being included today. There are elements of memoir in other books, but David Sedaris writes essay collections. He doesn't write full-length things. He writes essay collections that are based off of his personal diaries. And there are these really kind of funny, insightful, sometimes a little bit political, discussions about things that happen in his life, in his childhood, with his partner, with his family, things that occur to him on tour. And yeah, he narrates all the audiobooks himself. I would absolutely recommend audio is the way to go with David Sedaris. I myself refuse to read his books any other way. They have to be through audiobook. But for me, they're just really lighthearted. They're like something to pick up when I'm feeling like I just feel a little blah. They're short. And very frequently I laugh really, really hard, although I don't think his humor will be for everybody. I'll put up the covers of the 6 books that I've read from him. You can start anywhere. It doesn't matter. My personal favorite is Let's Explore Diabetes with Owls, but all of the books are the same and they don't need to be read in any sort of specific order. That was a lot. I don't know how long this video is going to be after I edit it down, but these are some of my favorite nonfiction authors. I love nonfiction, and yeah, these are the ones that I'm most excited about, most excited for them to release new books. And yeah, I'm very curious, very, very curious. If you like these books or these authors and you have authors that you think are similar, you can let me down below. If you want to try and down select which of these books you should try and pick up first, and we can talk about it down below as well. But yeah, I love nonfiction. I thought this would be a fun way to kind of round out the end of Nonfiction November, and I hope it was something that you enjoyed watching as well. So yeah, please take care, and I will see you next time. Bye.